You are not a person. You are a piece of equipment that happens to talk, and somewhere in the back of your owner's account book, right between the value of his plow oxen and his olive press, there is a line for you. And your single most important function, the reason you might be kept fed and occasionally even rewarded, is that your body can manufacture more equipment exactly like you. You are a thing. Let's start with the legal basics, because they are genuinely bleak. In Roman law, you are not a human being with rights. You are a res, a word that simply means a thing, a piece of property in the same legal category as a chair, a goat, or a sack of grain. The fancier term for you is mancipium, meaning something taken in hand. You cannot own property, you cannot legally marry, you cannot bring a case to court, and your word means nothing unless it is dragged out of you under torture. That last part is not me being dramatic. Roman courts treated the testimony of a slave as worthless, unless it was extracted while you were being tortured, on the cheerful theory that a slave would only tell the truth under physical pain. So even your honesty was something they took by force, and they marked you as property too. If you ever ran and got caught, you might be branded on the forehead with a hot iron, or fitted with a metal collar riveted around your neck. Some of those collars have actually survived, stamped with messages aimed at passing strangers rather than at you. They say things along the lines of, "I have run away, hold me, and return me to my master, and you will get a reward." Read that again. You were not even the intended audience for the words bolted to your own throat. You were the lost property the words were describing. Want to know precisely how the law saw you? There was a famous old statute called the Lex Aquilia that dealt with property damage. If someone killed your owner's slave, meaning you, the law handled it in the very same sentence as someone killing a farm animal. The penalty was identical. The guilty party paid your owner the highest market value you had reached in the past year, not a punishment for murder, a reimbursement for damaged livestock. You and a cow were, legally speaking, line items in the same paragraph. Hold on to that image, because it explains absolutely everything that comes next. Born inside the house. So where do new slaves actually come from? For a long time, mostly from war. While Rome was busy conquering everything in sight, especially during the brutal wars against Carthage, captured prisoners flooded the markets by the hundreds of thousands. Defeat an enemy city, enslave the survivors, sell them off, repeat. Easy supply. Then Rome more or less ran out of obvious things to conquer. The Great Wars slowed down. The empire settled into the long peace historians call the Pax Romana, and the river of fresh war captives shrank to a trickle. But the Romans still needed a staggering number of slaves to run everything, so they turned to the other source. They turned to you. A slave born inside the household had a special name, a verna, and owners adored verni for cold, practical reasons. There was no purchase price to pay. There was no risk of buying a stranger at auction who turned out to be sick, dishonest, or secretly broken. A homeborn slave was raised from infancy, knowing the household, trained exactly the way the master wanted, and assumed to be more loyal, because this was the only world they had ever known. Modern historians who have tried to crunch the numbers think that over time, slaves born at home probably became the single biggest source of new slaves in the entire empire, bigger than war, bigger than the slave trade. Nobody can prove the exact figures, and the estimates are honestly pretty shaky, but the direction is clear. The Roman slave population had quietly learned how to refill itself. And you were the refill. Just how many of you were there? Nobody knows for certain, and anyone who gives you a confident figure is bluffing, because Rome never ran a slave census we can read. But modern scholars build careful estimates, and the usual guess is that under the Emperor Augustus, Roman Italy held somewhere around 1.2 million slaves, maybe 15 to 20% of everyone living there. Across the wider empire, the share was lower, perhaps 1 in 10 people. Whatever the true number, it was enormous, and a population that size does not maintain itself by accident. It maintains itself through births, through you. And here is the part the cold economics misses. A verna was not only an asset, sometimes a verna was loved. We have a poem by a Roman writer named Martial mourning a little homeborn girl named Erotian who died just before her 6th birthday. He paid for her funeral, wrote aching verses about her, and asked the spirits of the dead to be gentle with her. She was, legally, his property. He grieved her with the raw, helpless grief of a parent. Both of those things were true at once, and that contradiction sits at the whole strange heart of Roman slavery. The farming manual. Here is where it gets genuinely sick, and where the grim comedy of your situation really lands. We actually have the instruction manuals. A Roman writer named Columella produced a 12-book guide to running a farm somewhere around the year 60 AD. It covers soil, vines, olives, cattle, the entire operation, and tucked into the section on managing your workforce, sitting right beside advice on livestock and crops, Columella casually lays out his system for encouraging the enslaved women to reproduce. His policy was simple. A slave woman who gave birth to 3 sons earned a break from her regular work. A woman who produced even more children earned her freedom outright. He calls these rewards, in his own words, The way you would describe a staff bonus scheme. He does not think he is being a monster. In his own mind, he is being a good manager, optimizing output. The output just happens to be babies. The truly unsettling thing about Columella is that he comes across as one of the nicer ones. In the same breath, he advises owners to actually talk to their slaves, to chain them only when necessary, to inspect the ergastulum, the underground barracks where field slaves were sometimes locked up at night, and to keep everyone reasonably content. Why? Not out of the goodness of his heart. Because, as he explains, a content slave works harder and breeds more reliably than a miserable one. Every kindness in the manual is really a productivity tip. When a Roman tells you to be gentle with your slaves, he is giving you maintenance advice for your machinery. He was not some lone weirdo, either. An earlier writer named Varro, who wrote his own farming handbook, discussed sending women out to live with the herdsmen who watched the flocks in far-off pastures. The women would cook, keep the men content, and produce children to keep the labor stocked. Varro slots this advice in right next to his chapters on breeding cattle, sheep, and pigs. The structure of his book quietly tells you everything. To these men, your reproduction was simply another branch of animal husbandry, a paragraph in a section about maintaining productive stock. You were not raising a family. You were maintaining inventory, not a stud farm. Before your imagination runs off to some horror movie vision of Roman breeding factories, let's pump the brakes, because the reality is somehow both more boring and more disturbing. There were no industrial stud farms in ancient Rome. Nobody was running giant operations that bred slaves in bulk to sell the babies for profit. And the reason is pure accounting. Raising a child costs years and years of food, shelter, and care before that child is old enough to do a single day of useful work. By the time a homebred slave could actually earn their keep, the owner had sunk a small fortune into feeding them. Quite often, it was simply cheaper to buy a fully grown adult who could work the moment you brought them home. So breeding slaves for the open market mostly did not make financial sense. This is one big way Roman slavery split off from the plantation slavery of much later centuries, where enslavers in places such as the American South deliberately bred people to sell, treating human reproduction as a literal cash crop. Rome, by and large, did not do that. Rome did something quieter. What you got instead was quieter and, honestly, creepier. Owners did not build baby factories. They built incentives. They nudged. They encouraged the unions likely to produce children, rewarded the women who delivered, and let nature handle the expensive part for free. Your reproduction was not forced down some mechanical assembly line. It was managed, steered, and rewarded, woven so smoothly into normal household life that it barely registered as a deliberate policy at all. The horror here is not a factory. The horror is how casual it was. Your marriage isn't real. Let's say you fall in love. It happens, even here, especially here. You find another slave in the household, you build something together, maybe you have children. Congratulations. According to Roman law, none of it exists. Slaves were not permitted to legally marry. Real marriage required a right called connubium, and as a piece of property, you simply did not have it. What you could have instead was a contubernium, a word that originally meant soldiers sharing a tent. It was a relationship the Romans recognized socially but absolutely not legally. No rights came with it. None. Your partner was not your husband or wife in any way the law cared about, and your children were not legally yours. They belonged, like you, to your owner. And this is the part that turns your blood to ice. At any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, your owner could sell your partner to an estate in another province. He could sell your children off separately. He could shatter everything you had built with a single transaction. And there was not one court in the entire Roman Empire where you could so much as object. And yet, despite every bit of that, enslaved people built families anyway. We know because they left behind thousands of tombstones, partners buried together, parents grieving children, proudly using that word contubernalis to name the person the law insisted was nothing to them. They loved each other in open defiance of a system engineered to treat that love as irrelevant. Your odds of keeping that family together depended enormously on who owned you. The slaves with the best shot were the ones in the grandest households, especially the imperial household, the Familia Caesaris, the vast staff of slaves and freedmen who ran the emperor's affairs. Those slaves were the most likely to be educated, promoted, and eventually freed, and their families show up again and again in the inscriptions. A generous owner might even free a couple together, on purpose, so they could finally do as freed people what the law forbade them as slaves: get properly married. Imagine needing your owner's permission to make your own marriage legally real. That was the best-case version of your love life, whatever the master wants. There is no gentle way to cover this part, so we will be direct and then move on. As a slave, your body was not your own in any sense, including the most intimate one. Your owner had the legal right to use you sexually, regardless of your gender, and you had no legal ability to refuse. The Roman idea of sexual violation simply did not apply to what an owner did with his own property. A crime needs a victim with rights, and in the eyes of the law, you had none. Roman society was genuinely obsessed with the honor and chastity of its freeborn citizens, and it had strict laws guarding both. Not one of those protections reached you. The exact same act that counted as a grave crime when done to a freeborn Roman was, when done to a slave, just an owner making use of his property. Your suffering did not even register as a wrong, because the law had already decided, in advance, that you were not the kind of being who could be wronged. If your owner fathered a child with you, that changed nothing, not for you and not for the child. By Roman law, that baby was born a slave and belonged to the household, exactly the same as any other slave's child. The master's blood counted for nothing unless he personally chose to acknowledge the child and free them, which sometimes happened, and far more often did not. The same legal power that made a Roman father the absolute ruler of his freeborn family made you, and any child of yours, just more of his property to use however he liked. Follows the womb. So whose child is it, exactly? Roman law had a chillingly tidy answer, and it is a phrase that would go on to haunt slavery for the next 2,000 years. Partus sequitur ventrum. The offspring follows the womb. It meant a child's status was decided entirely by the mother. If your mother was a slave, you were born a slave. Full stop, no matter who your father was, and the child belonged to the mother's owner. This single rule is the engine of the entire system. It is exactly why your fertility was an asset on the books. Every child you delivered was, the very instant it drew breath, the legal property of the man who owned you. You did not make a son or a daughter. You generated, in the eyes of the law, an increase in his estate. The Roman lawyers genuinely argued about this, and the debate is darkly fascinating. When an enslaved woman was on loan, with one person owning her while another held the right to use her, the jurists fought over who got to keep the baby. Did the child count as fructus, meaning fruit, the natural profit a piece of property generates, the way a tree gives apples or a flock gives lambs? After some serious legal back and forth, they actually decided no. One jurist's ruling got preserved forever in Roman law. A human being cannot be among the fruits of a human being, which sounds almost decent, right up until you remember what the argument itself reveals. They were not debating whether you were property. That part was already settled. They were only debating which owner got to bank the profit when you gave birth. And that tidy little phrase did not die with Rome. Partus sequitur ventrum got picked up, dusted off, and written straight into the slave laws of far later societies, including the American colonies. More than 1,000 years afterward, the Romans built a legal machine for turning a woman's children into someone else's property, and it ran so smoothly that other empires would simply borrow the blueprint. Pets and nurses. Your children, assuming they were not sold off first, could end up in a few different roles, and some of them are stranger than you would expect. If a child was pretty and charming, they might become a delicia, which translates to roughly a pet or a darling. These were slave children kept around wealthy homes purely as living decoration and entertainment, pampered little favorites who amused guests and made their owners look fashionable. It sounds almost sweet, until you remember that a pet has no control over anything, including its own body, and these children were horribly vulnerable to abuse. Some boys were even castrated to keep them looking young and pretty for longer, cherished and completely powerless at the same time. Then there were the foundlings. Romans who did not want a newborn would sometimes leave the infant outside to be picked up by whoever wanted it, and plenty of people scooped up these abandoned babies specifically to raise them as slaves. A child taken in and raised this way even had its own label, an alumnus, a sort of foster nursling, whose legal status was a genuine mess. By rights, a freeborn baby should not have lost its freedom just from being abandoned. In practice, whoever found you and fed you tended to treat you as theirs to keep. The practice was so widespread that the Emperor Trajan himself had to issue a ruling about it, after his official Pliny wrote in asking what to do with freeborn children who had been raised in servitude. Trajan decided they could reclaim their freedom, and did not even have to repay the cost of their own upbringing, which tells you that demanding repayment was apparently a thing some owners tried. And if you happened to be a woman who had just given birth, your body had one more use to offer: your milk. Enslaved wet nurses fed and raised their owners' children, which meant that even nursing, even the most basic act of feeding a baby, was an economic service you provided to somebody else's family while your own child waited its turn. Some of you got out. Now, for the genuinely surprising part, the thing that made Roman slavery different from a lot of what came later. You could actually get out. Freedom was a real, regular, achievable thing. The Romans had an entire system for freeing slaves, called manumission, and they did it constantly. A freed slave became a libertus. And here is the remarkable bit. A freed slave of a Roman citizen generally became a Roman citizen too. Not fully equal, with a few restrictions attached, but a citizen. And your children, if they were born after you got your freedom, were born completely free. Full citizens with no asterisk on them at all. One generation, that was the entire distance between owned property and Roman citizen. How did you earn it? Sometimes, through that very breeding incentive we already talked about. Sometimes an owner freed you in his will, as a final act of generosity or vanity. And sometimes you flat out bought yourself. Slaves were often allowed to keep a private stash of money called a peculium, technically still owned by the master but managed entirely by you. A clever, careful slave could save for years and literally purchase their own freedom. Some slaves did so well managing the peculium that they even owned an under-slave of their own, called a vicarious. Yes, you read that correctly. A slave could effectively own another slave. The system had layers. There were a few official ways to be freed: by a formal ceremony before a magistrate, by being entered on the censor's rolls, or by a clause in your owner's will. But there were catches, because Augustus actually got nervous about how many slaves were being freed, and passed laws to slow it down. One law set minimum ages. Your owner had to be at least 20, and you had to be at least 30 for the full version. Another capped how many slaves a single will could free. And if you were freed too young or too informally, you did not become a full citizen at all. You became something called a Junian Latin, a halfway status, free but stuck with reduced rights. Freedom, it turned out, came in tears. But when it worked, it really worked. The Emperor Claudius ran much of his government through former slaves. Two of his freedmen, named Narcissus and Pallas, became so powerful and so obscenely rich that senators, actual blue-blooded Roman aristocrats, had to grovel to them for favors. These were men who had started life as somebody's property and ended up among the wealthiest people in the empire. When a government has to pass laws to stop people from freeing too many slaves, and ex-slaves are out-earning senators, you know freedom was happening on a very serious scale. Just do not get carried away. Your odds depended heavily on what kind of slave you were. The educated city slave, the trusted secretary, the skilled craftsman, those people had a genuine shot. The thousands of nameless workers breaking their bodies on the big agricultural estates, chained in the barracks at night, mostly did not. For them, freedom was a story that happened to other slaves. And for a woman valued mainly for the children she could produce, the cruelest version of the bargain was this: the surest road to your freedom ran straight through your own womb. Hand the estate enough new property, enough new little Verne, and you might just purchase your own way out using your own children as the currency. Not what you pictured. A few things about your situation probably need correcting, because Hollywood has done a real number on the popular image of Roman slavery. First, it was not based on race. There was no color line. Slaves came from everywhere the Romans reached, from Gaul to Greece to North Africa to the Near East. And once freed, they blended into the general population. A Roman could not glance at a crowd and pick out the slaves by their appearance. Second, slaves were not all toiling in fields and mines, though plenty certainly were. An enslaved person could be a doctor, a teacher, an accountant, or a business manager running an entire enterprise on the master's behalf. Greek slaves in particular were prized as tutors for the children of the elite, and some skilled slaves were better educated than the people who owned them. The household leaned on them completely. A trusted slave called a dispensator might manage all of the master's money. A slave physician kept the whole family alive. A Greek tutor walked the master's son to school and drilled him in poetry and rhetoric. The Roman elite handed their finances, their health, and their children's entire education to people they legally owned outright, which is its own special kind of strange. There was even a famous comic character, a loud, vulgar ex-slave named Trimalchio in a Roman novel, who got fabulously rich after winning his freedom and threw grotesque, over-the-top dinner parties. He was pure fiction, a caricature, but he was built on a real type, because some freedmen really did become extravagantly wealthy. Do not let any of that trick you into thinking it was soft. This was still a system where you could be flogged, branded, chained in a barracks, tortured for evidence, and killed. All of it perfectly legal. The educated tutor and the chained field hand were both, in the end, property. Comfort was never freedom, and a kind master was still a master. The increase. So, that is your life. You are born in the house, counted in a ledger somewhere between the livestock and the tools. Your value rises and falls partly on your ability to produce more of yourself. The man who owns you might be cruel or might be generous, might work you to death or might free you after your fourth child, and you have no way of knowing which, because not one piece of it is your choice. Your body, your partner, your children, your labor, even your milk, all of it belongs to someone else, and the law has carefully thought through every single piece of it. And when you finally die, here is what you can hope for. If you were lucky enough to have people who loved you, and just enough money set aside, you might earn a small niche in one of those crowded tombs the Romans built, a columbarium, a name that literally means dovecote, after its honeycomb of little niches, each one just big enough for a single urn. Hundreds of compartments stacked together, each holding the ashes of a slave or a freed slave. Someone scratches your name into the stone, and maybe the name of your contubernalis right beside you, the partner the law swore up and down was nothing to you. That scratch in the rock becomes the only proof you were ever here at all. The ledger spent your whole life calling you an increase. The stone, at last, calls you by your name.